It's Dynasty season, and today we're talking the most volatile position in Dynasty football. It's the running backs on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Today we're talking running backs. If you haven't already, make sure you go check out my last video about quarterbacks. You can also check out my full rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. That includes my rookie rankings as well. If you need any advice, you can hit us up in the comments or over at Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or at Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Plus, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. But let's get into my top 50 running back rankings. I'll be taking you through each player, talking about when you should value them, about what life cycle of your team makes the most sense for them, and how to value them relative to each other. And it's important to remember, especially with running backs in general, you really should be targeting running backs when you're in a win now situation. If you're not aiming to win right now at all, you really don't need strong running backs on your team at all. Essentially, you want to be using the worst running backs possible because you want to be drafting those guys at the last minute or getting in the very youngest running backs who might be moving into roles, guys that you can potentially sell later for a profit or that you can use in a couple of years' time when you're ready to challenge. But one guy that everyone should want in their team, regardless of the situation, is Bijan Robinson. For me, he is the number one running back in fantasy football, and he will be for a number of years. He's in a run-first offense that's only going to improve. This is a team that's going to start winning more games with their defense improving. They do want to run the ball a lot. They can't rely on Michael Penix to really run this offense. He's going to be able to get them scoring, but Robinson needs to be the number one guys. I'd expect an increase in receiving yardage. I'd expect over 300 carries again this season. I think it would be a real shock if he doesn't get around 15 plus touchdowns. I think if he's not a top three running back at the end of the season, it's probably because he had an injury or something went very wrong. So he remains the number one guy, but Jahmyr Gibbs is not far behind. We don't really know exactly what's happening with David Montgomery and how his role is going to look, but even with Montgomery there, Gibbs is still getting 250 odd carries and a heap of receptions, and he remains one of the most efficient running backs in football. He's averaging over 5.4 yards per carry, which is insane, and he had 20 touchdowns last season. Now, that is going to regress, I think, but I do still expect that this is a guy that we're going to be able to rely on long term. The one thing he needs for the Lions to stay strong and continue to be winning games, assuming that happens, he's going to be a fantasy asset. And he's still very young, only going into his third season. He doesn't have a lot of tread on his tires. So he's definitely someone you want in fantasy as well. I did toss up putting Ashton Genty ahead of him. But I do have concerns around their offense, how much they're going to be able to move the ball and actually score points. He's someone that should be good in fantasy for some time, but I do think he's a little bit overrated relative to what a lot of people are saying. He was legitimately a top six pick this year, but this was a weaker draft class. And I think in a lot of draft classes, he's getting taken a lot lower. So you can't really consider him as a true top six pick. I think most years he's going outside the top 10. But because of his early pick, we know that the Raiders are going to use him. They weren't happy with what they got last season. And I expect a massive amount of receiving yardage in particular. I think in PPR, you're looking at a likely top 5 running back, potentially better, and you're looking at a guy who's going to be good for some time. The only concern for me is that we didn't really see him play in a strong offense against strong defenses on a weekly basis. And we saw when that occurred, he did have some struggles. Hard to know how much of that was O-line caused and how much of that was based on his ability against a better defense. But there are some reasons that he may potentially struggle initially. I think that's unlikely, but it is possible and it's reason to take a little bit of a pause before reaching for him above the other guys. Now, Saquon Barkley, very likely to be my number one running back in redraft this year. If you're trying to win now, he's essentially the number one running back in Dynasty. I do think he's well above everybody else. 2,000 rushing yards last season is insane. Nearly 350 carries. Still pretty solid through the air, but because of how that offense works, he's not quite as strong as an aerial threat despite his receiving ability. Had his lowest receiving yardage total on a per game basis in his career. Obviously, when you don't have someone like Daniel Jones checking you down the ball, you're not going to get as many receptions when Jalen Hurts is more inclined to run with it. But with how much he was able to open up running lanes because of Hurts' running ability, it did mean Barkley was very efficient. 5.8 yards per carry is insane and well above anything we've seen from him before. I expect he's going to have another big season this season. I'm not sure that he's definitively going to be the number one running back in PPR. I think in half PPR, there's a very good chance he will be. But in PPR, I think he's definitely going to be top 3, assuming no injuries happen. He's someone, if you're winning now in Dynasty, or if you're challenging now in Dynasty, you definitely want on your team. My concern with Taylor is his ability to play in a weaker offense and still produce. His efficiency has been pretty good the last couple of seasons, even though he's been battling injuries. And you do also have to realize that there is some injury risk, as there is with any running back. But with Taylor, it has been particularly bad the last few seasons. He does essentially come into this season the healthiest he's been for quite some time. And he was a number one running back a few seasons ago before the injuries happened. So there still remains a lot of upside here. He's still got plenty of years ahead of him. He's only 26, which isn't young for a running back, but we've seen plenty of running backs go into their 30s like Derrick Henry. So there's no reason JT can't do that if he can stay healthy. It's just that injury risk is a reason to move him down relative to the others. Having said that, I still have him as my number 5 running back because I feel like he's the most locked into a role. I feel like he's the least likely to end up in a committee situation. You can't see Khalil Herbert coming in and taking over a lot of carries, and I really don't rate DJ Giddens that highly, so I don't think he's going to come in and have an impact either. I think Taylor is ultimately the guy. It is a bit of a concern that someone like an Anthony Richardson isn't going to check down that much, but it's possible Daniel Jones gets the role and all of a sudden Jonathan Taylor becomes a PPR monster as well. So I do like the upside here. He's someone that I think you can get pretty cheap at the moment, and he's someone I'd be trading for, especially if the team that owns him is in a little bit of a rebuild. Breece Hall has been getting a lot of hate because of how he played last season, but that was partly because the team just struggled in general. Hall didn't look particularly good, but the team looked poor, and I do think that we expect to step up from them this year. I think Justin Fields will be able to open up a lot more holes with his running ability, and that will make it easier for Hall. The main concerns here are firstly whether we see a lot more of Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis. We have heard talk about that being a possibility, and that would really hurt Breece Hall. But we're still talking about a guy who's only 24. He's certainly got the ability to rebound, and he's coming towards the end of his rookie contract. So if he doesn't like the situation he's in, he could easily go elsewhere and get back into an every down role. So because of his age, he is someone that if you're rebuilding, you can certainly trade for and feel pretty good about him looking good in a year or two's time. So if you're thinking that a year or two away is your target window, then Breece Hall is a good guy to trade for, knowing that in a couple of years' time, he might suddenly have a bounce back in value. Chase Brown, on the other hand, kind of came out of nowhere last season. We did know that there was a possibility of it happening. We heard reports about him working hard and doing a very good job during the offseason, but we hear those reports from their agents all the time. As it turned out, Brown did take over the number 1 role, but he wasn't particularly efficient. There were concerns about his run blocking and his usage on third downs, and they brought Samaje Perine in, who's definitely going to be in there as a third down back. That does mean there is some reason for concern for Brown in PPR leagues. Having said that, with his rushing ability and how strong this offense is, I do still think he's someone that you can rely on as a very good fantasy asset for the long term. Obviously, still very young, only 25, so we should have a good half dozen seasons ahead of him. Whether he can stay as the lead runner is a real question, though. It's kind of crazy that he's up at number 7, but everybody from this point downwards has some serious downside. And I think Brown's downside is a risk of losing the job. I don't think it's likely to happen with Zach Moss this season, but I do think it is possible to happen in the future that they draft someone else in and all of a sudden this becomes a committee very quickly. Another guy that could easily end up in a committee as well is Kyren Williams. The team just keep wanting to draft running backs, and that's a real concern. However, having said that, they brought in Blake Corum last year, and it made no difference to Kyren Williams at all. He ran the ball 316 times and also had 34 receptions, which was a step forward from the season before. It's just there was a lot more competition for running backs last season. So Williams should remain with that role, despite them bringing in Jarquez Hunter. I think that Hunter is more of a backup guy. I'm not sure that they were happy with what they saw from Blake Corum for whatever reason. I don't know why they're so desperate for backup running backs, but I do feel like Williams will remain the number 1 guy going into this season. And even if that doesn't happen this season, you can easily see him moving on to another team and becoming the lead guy there. Obviously, his efficiency took a big ding last season, but in general, I think the team didn't quite look as good on the ground, and I can expect that that will rebound a little bit going into this season. He's still got a lot of touchdown upside, which is the big thing with Williams, and I think he'll solidly be in the conversation as a top 10 running back for this season. Somebody that you should definitely be targeting if you're in a win now window is Christian McCaffrey. I would not be surprised if he bounces back and he's the number one running back in football this season. I'll probably rank him number 2, though I haven't finished my redraft rankings, but he's right up there with Saquon Barkley as being an absolute weapon. They've said outright they're going to give him as much of the ball as they can. They haven't got as much behind him this season. I don't think Garendo is going to threaten him for touches, and none of the other guys they've brought in are particularly concerning either, especially with no Deebo Samuel now. That's another guy who's not going to take carries away from him. So I feel like McCaffrey's going to get as much as he can eat on a consistent basis and should move back to that 2023 season where he was the definitive number 1 in football and that had him being taken number 1 in redraft leagues as well. So Christian McCaffrey is someone I'm definitely targeting if I'm in a win now window, because you can get him on the cheaper side because he's heading towards being 30 years old. At number 10 for me is Devon Achane, and I don't like this at all. I don't think Achane deserves to be a top 10 running back. It's just that I don't believe in any of the other guys below him either. We know that he has explosive upside. He was amazing in his first season, but the whole offense struggled in its second season, and I feel like we're kind of headed towards a little bit of a rebuild. Having said that, teams that go towards rebuilds often end up running the ball a surprising amount. If they do something like sell Tyreek Hill, and maybe even Jalen Waddle and start bringing in younger guys, all of a sudden you're going to need to rely on Achane. You're going to see a lot more action in the passing game. I can imagine a situation where he becomes a PPR monster because of that. He was a top 5 running back last season, despite not being particularly good by his standards. And it's not that they've come in and replaced any of the down the depth chart guys. I don't think Ollie Gordon is going to come in and be a massive threat straight away. Jalen Wright looks okay, and he is that big back complement. And Alexander Madison will just kind of be a depth chart guy they can use for his blocking ability. But I do think that Achane is going to be the definitive number 1 guy here. And I'll happily still have him on my roster. I just wouldn't be too excited about the possibilities. Now, the benefit of these next 2 guys, they do at least appear to be the number 1 guy in their offense. We've seen that Green Bay wants to make Josh Jacobs the guy. They gave him 300 carries last season, and he had a very strong season. The question is, are they going to keep running the ball as much as they did, or was bringing Matthew Golden in an indication that they do want to become a little bit more pass-heavy so they can challenge against those better offenses when the game gets high scoring? I think that's very possible. I still think Jacobs is going to be a legitimate weapon. He did come into the league pretty young, and he's now entering his 7th season. Having said that, he still played 17 games last season, so it's not like he's having massive injury concerns. I do think that you're going to get another couple of good years out of him, but because this is Dynasty, that's a slight ding on his value. If you're in a win-now situation, though, Jacobs is someone I love getting into my team. James Cook is in a slightly different situation. I do think there is a reason to be concerned about Ray Davis coming in and threatening carries in certain parts of the field. I also think that Ty Johnson being a third down back threatens him as well. But James Cook managed to have 18 touchdowns last season and still had over 200 carries, over 1,000 yards. He's going to be very efficient. He's someone that you can expect to be around that running back 10 region. He rarely misses a game, which makes him very, very consistent. And I would just roster Ray Davis as his backup if you're concerned about that anyway, because I think that Davis slots into that same role in those situations. So Cook is someone I feel pretty good about as a relatively young option. You're going to get a couple of good seasons remaining from him, but the upside is a little bit capped because they don't use him in the passing game much because of Ty Johnson, just because of how Josh Allen plays. So that's why he's outside the top 10, but still someone you can feel pretty good about in fantasy if you're trying to win now. In behind him is Bucky Irving, and he certainly has a lot more upside. He rushed very well last season. He was a solid receiving option, but with Rachaad White still around, I don't think you can feel very good about him getting a consistently good workload. We've seen when teams start to load up these sort of running backs, their efficiency really drops, and I feel like they would prefer to have both of these guys running efficiently than giving the full load to one of them. And for that reason, I think that Irving is naturally going to be limited to more of a committee back. Having said that, I think he's still going to be better than last season when he was the running back 15. So there's certainly upside here, not so much in the passing game, but in his ability to get more carries and remain relatively efficient. Plus, we know this offense looks like it's going to be pretty explosive again this season. So he's someone that you can feel pretty solid about in Dynasty. Now we talk about the rookies, and all of these rookies are pretty similar to me. Amari and Hampton, I feel better about the talent than about the situation. I do think this could be a real committee here with Najee Harris, and that makes me very nervous. He's the first guy on this list where I think there's a risk that he could truly be the number 2 running back in his team. I know that Achan's a little bit in that situation, but at least with Achan, you know he's the number 1. It's just there's going to be a lot of carries elsewhere. With Hampton, he could legitimately be behind Harris for some time. I do think he will eventually work his way into that number 1 role, but I think that Harris is still going to get plenty of touches in those heavy workload situations, the short yardage situations. Having said that, Hampton can certainly play on every down. Very solid receiver. I can imagine a situation where he does take over the number 1 role in a run-heavy offense and becomes very good in the next couple of years' time. The problem is they still have Harris there, at least for this year, so you're going to have to be patient with Hampton. Likewise, you're going to have to be patient with Quinshon Judkins because I do think that they'll probably still use a little bit of Jerome Ford initially, but I do think that Judkins can take over and be the Nick Chubb in this offense. We know when this offense is struggling, they do tend to lean on the run game. They don't really have the weapons to do it through the air at the moment, and certainly they don't have the quarterbacks to do it. So I'd expect plenty of checkdowns. I'd expect plenty of volume. I do think that Judkins has plenty of upside and is someone you can expect a lot of this season. Same thing with Travion Henderson. Goes into a little bit of a committee situation in a weaker team, but I do think they're going to give him plenty of the ball because you do see that those weaker teams do want to run the ball to take the pressure off their quarterback. In this case, it's Drake May, who still has some questionable receiving options. And for that reason, I think that having a good run game really helps him out. I do think that Henderson takes over from Ramondre Stevenson, but I don't think he's taken over fully. Stevenson got paid a lot of money. They've still also got Antonio Gibson in there. I feel like this will be initially kind of ugly, but I do expect Henderson to take over the lead role properly at some stage. Then we go into a much messier situation. In fact, a couple of much messier situations. Isaiah Pacheco should be the number 1 guy if he can play like he did in 2023 and 2022. We know he has that capacity. It's not like they've brought in any real threats. I'm not really too concerned about Elijah Mitchell or Kareem Hunt. They just don't look like the players they used to be. But I've talked about Smith as their number 4 running back nominally at the moment. Even though he's a 7th rounder, I know that my colleague Kiwi thinks very highly of him and think there's a good chance if he doesn't take over, he at least becomes that Jerick McKinnon guy 3rd down back. That would really hurt Pacheco, who was getting a lot of his volume through the receiving work in 2023. So we'll see if Pacheco can bounce back there. There's a massive amount of risk here, but also some very solid upside of being a possible top 10 back if he does get that clear lead role. Same issue with Tyrone Tracy. Obviously, they brought in Cam Scatterboo. That's the wrong way around, Cam Scatterboo. And obviously, that means that Tracy should take a hit there. But I still think that Tracy is the better back. He's certainly a more explosive back. I do feel like he could easily remain the number 1 guy in this offense. And they just give Scatterboo those kind of short yardage situations, and Tracy gets a whole heap of touches. Plus, if that's not going to work, I can imagine Tracy getting traded. I feel like he's a good enough back that he's going to hang around as a running back too for the next 5 to 10 seasons in fantasy, and that gives him heaps of value in Dynasty. Joe Mixon, on the other hand, is coming towards the end of his time as a fantasy asset. This is now his 9th season. He has been hit by injuries on and off, but he has still consistently managed to perform quite well. Not so much efficiently, but certainly as a fantasy asset. He's been the top 13 each of the last 4 seasons, and I imagine that continues in Houston, especially with this offense likely to look a lot better this year. So I do think that Mixon is someone that you can still hang on to for a couple of seasons more. The main concerns here are, firstly, I do really like Woody Marks. He was very good last year, especially as a receiving back. And I feel like he's more of a threat than Dameon Pierce was last year. So I could imagine Mixon losing some touches. And plus, I could imagine them dialing him back just to keep him healthy. But there's still going to be plenty of scoring opportunities. So he's someone you can rely on as a solid running back too for the near future. Kenneth Walker's another guy who's in that committee situation with Charbonnet. In fact, there were times last year where he got less than half of the snaps, but he was so efficient with the opportunities he got. When he's healthy, he's a very good option. The problem is he can't stay healthy, and his yards per carry has really dropped. I do think with the offense in general turning a little bit more pass heavy with less receiving options, we will continue to see Walker getting a lot of touches. The problem is, can he be efficient with them? Can this offense be as high scoring as it has been the last few seasons? And can we see him do a little bit more work in the red zone? He's yet to have a season with double-digit carries. There's lots of risk here, and he is in the last year of his contract. So I do have concerns about what that means afterwards and whether he ends up in a committee situation. DeAndre Swift was a real surprise that they didn't bring in anyone else last offseason. Having said that, whether they're going to be able to run the ball effectively is a real question mark. They've revamped their offensive line, and for that reason, I feel like Swift could be a real sleeper this season. But even if he gets a whole heap of carries and the offensive line is better, it might be that the pass game improves and all of a sudden he's not as heavily involved. He only had 6 touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. He was averaging less than 4 yards per carry last season. I expect that to jump, but I expect the receiving yardage to go down a little bit because they don't need to check down the ball as much. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 with Swift, but I do think he is still going to be a lead running back, at least for this season. I'm just concerned about what happens with him in the long term, and that's why I've dropped him down a little bit relative to the others. Right behind him is a guy that you should be taking now if you're in a win-now situation, especially in a non-PPR or half PPR league. We know that Derrick Henry remains the number one guy. I do think that at some stage we're going to see Kid Mitchell come in and have a significantly heavier role within the next season or two. I do think they really like him. It's just that injuries have really slowed him down. But until that happens, Henry remains the number one guy, and he can run so efficiently in this offense. He was getting nearly 6 yards a carry last season, 18 touchdowns. He doesn't get a lot of receiving work, but he's so consistent on a game-by-game basis. He's getting 100 yards every second season. So especially in leagues where you're getting bonuses for big yardage games, I know there are plenty of leagues that will give you a couple of extra points just because a player goes over 100 yards. Derrick Henry gives you extra value in that situation. I do think you should be valuing him a little bit high because of that. It's a little bit hard to know what to do with Chuba Hubbard with Jonathan Brooks at some stage possibly coming back in the next season or two, and the fact that they just want to keep drafting running backs. They brought in EDN, obviously. That's Trevor, not Travis. And they also have a heap of other guys down the depth chart. They've still got guys like Rico Dowdle, who came in as like a complimentary back for this season. It's just really ugly. But they gave Hubbard so much money. I think they just want to run the ball, and they know that Hubbard's the number one guy, but they want some strong backups. I don't like what they're doing in general. I rarely like what the Panthers are doing. I don't think they brought in the right guys to improve their pass offense. Even though Ted McMillan's a great player, I think they should have been sorting out the defense. That would have made running the ball a whole lot easier than improving your wide receivers. So not sure what to expect from Hubbard, but I do think he's going to be the number one guy, at least for the near future after they gave him that big contract. Coming in behind him is another rookie, Caleb Johnson. Goes into a solid situation in Pittsburgh, can take over from that Najee Harris role, but Jalen Warren's still been there. They gave him another contract. Obviously, they like him as a complimentary back, and he's still relatively young, even though he and Gainwell only got small contracts and 1-year contracts as well. But I do think that Johnson, at least initially, is probably not going to be even close to an every down back. He could grow into that, but I think there is a significant amount of risk. They only paid a third rounder for him. We haven't really seen him do this consistently at college, so it's hard to know exactly what to expect from him. There is a lot of upside here because of his talent, especially as a pure runner, but can he do it consistently at the NFL level? I'm not sure that he can, and that's why I'm ranking him lower than you might expect. Same thing with RJ Harvey. I think this was a massive massive reach by Denver. I think there were significantly better backs they could have taken. I would have preferred them to take Caleb Johnson here, for example. I feel like he would have been a better complement to Jaleel McLaughlin. This suggests to me that they believe that Estime can be that kind of bigger back, and they want Harvey to do all that other stuff. Problem with RJ Harvey, we haven't really seen him as a blocking back and do that successfully. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a lot more of Tyler Beatty and also Jaleel McLaughlin, probably one of those two, getting involved, and Estime getting plenty of touches. So I think this is going to remain a committee situation, but they had so few other holes that they could afford to pay up a little bit for the running back. I think they just paid for the wrong one, and we're going to see that Harvey finds it hard to stick around and be effective in the league. James Conner's another win now option, as is Tony Pollard. Both of these guys have been around for a long time, but Conner's been the better of the two backs. He was the running back 11 in PPR last season, but mainly because he had 400 receiving yards and nearly 50 receptions. That really helped, but he has managed to stay healthier of late and is someone that you can rely on. When Trey Benson came in, a lot of people were concerned what was happening with Conner. Conner got given another 2-year contract. So even though he's 30, he is someone you can rely on in a win-now situation. I'm not concerned about Benson coming in and taking over just yet. Similar situation with Tony Pollard. They brought in Ty J. Spears, and yet Pollard remained the number one guy, 260 touches and over 1,000 yards. Not particularly efficient, but I do think they'll be a little bit better this year with Cam Ward and with better wide receivers. I feel like that's going to improve Pollard's efficiency and mean they can keep him on the field and involved a little bit more often. Having said that, with his age and with his efficiency dropping, it is entirely possible he just drops out pretty quickly. And so there is a plenty of risk here. David Montgomery, obviously behind Jahmyr Gibbs and starting to lose touches as the season went on. He was still getting a lot of goal line work, had 13 touchdowns last season, and a surprising amount of receiving work as well. He's going to hang around, I think, for a couple of years to come. How efficient he and how effective he's able to be is the big question. I don't think his efficiency is a major concern, even though he's 28, and that's usually when that starts to drop off. I do think, however, that he might get less touches because Gibbs is just significantly more explosive and Montgomery's struggling to stay healthy. So I expect a couple more years in Detroit for him, but I do think his role continues to decrease. And we're talking about more of a running back 3 than a running back 2 in the longer future. Alvin Kamara is another guy who is definitely falling off. Obviously, he is 30 now, and that generally is a very bad sign for running backs. He was surprisingly efficient last year and got a lot of receiving yardage, but it's hard to tell what's going to happen with this offense in the future. I do think that we might see that they start to transition away from Kamara towards Miller potentially. Kendre Miller's now looking hopefully healthier, and if not, I also like Devin Neal a little bit as an option as well. So I don't think we can really rely on Kamara being the number one guy, and it wouldn't surprise me when his contract lapses at the end of this year if we simply see him move out and be done. So if you're taking him in fantasy, you don't really know what you're going to get this year, and you don't really know what you're going to get in the future. But he is someone where if you're trying to win now, you can slot in as an option at least to start the season while your other guys build up. In at 30, I've got Aaron Jones. He's in that similar situation in Minnesota. He's now 30. Obviously, they've got some other options in there like Jordan Mason. I think bringing him in was more of a complementary back situation rather than taking over from Jones. Jones was great last season. Finishes the running back 14, and I think he could have done even better. I think with JJ McCarthy, we know that rookie quarterbacks, and McCarthy's essentially a rookie playing his first season, do tend to check down to running backs a little bit more if they're not a running quarterback, and McCarthy isn't. So that really is going to potentially help Jones, and we know he's very, very good out of the backfield. Has had at least 47 receptions in 5 of the last 6 years. So that really helps as well. So I do think that Jones is someone that you can expect to have another solid season. It's just a question of whether he can maintain it longer term. And I feel like he is someone that you're only going to really be able to rely on for a couple of seasons. From this point, we get into the real risky guys who have unclear roles. I think Brian Robinson's the last guy that you can feel particularly good about with his role. I think he is still clearly the number one guy. Austin Eckler's now 30 and didn't look like the same guy last season, but it's not like Robinson looked great either. He's not really much of a receiving back. They've brought in, they were using McNichols a surprising amount. So even when Eckler got injured, it's not like Robinson was reliable. And I actually quite like Krosky Merritt, who came in as a 7th round draft pick as well. So I do think that Robinson remains the main guy, but I think it's unlikely you see him be an every down guy at any point in time. For that reason, in PPR, you really are limited in how much value you're going to get from him. And you can really only use him if you're in a situation where it's a very deep league, or alternatively where you're really punting at running back and just trying to get whoever's available. I am in leagues where I'm doing that, and Robinson is someone I'm having to use, but my wide receivers and everything else is stacked. That's really the only situation where Robinson is someone you can get much value out of. Otherwise, you're kind of better off selling him because there are still people who are willing to buy him based on how strong the team is looking in Washington. Now things get really ugly from this point forward. Javonte Williams is someone that I don't really back as a talent, but I do think that this role is probably his, at least for the near future. We're talking about a guy who played every game last season and had 500 rushing yards. Now, he did have 52 receptions, and I do think that we could see him get used there again this time. But with George Pickens turning up, all of a sudden there's quite a lot of other receiving options, and it's not like they're going to have to check down to him all the time. So I think this is probably a committee situation between him, Jalen Blue, Miles Sanders probably involved maybe on third downs, depending on what happens. Wouldn't surprise me if they bring someone else in at some point in time. But I think this could get very ugly quickly. And you're talking about a guy who maybe halfway through the season, all of a sudden isn't the lead runner. So you can start off with him, but the value is very limited and the upside is quite low. You got to, I guess, hope that he somehow turns into the lead back and Dallas turns into the old Dallas where they actually used to run the ball properly. I think that's highly unlikely, though. In fact, Blue, someone that I think has a little bit of value as a sleeper option. We'll talk about in a second. But Cam Scatterboo, I can't get his names the right way around today. I don't like the situation for him. I like the talent. I think he's a pure running back. I think he can be very good, one-cut runner. Very, very hard to get down. But he basically does what Tyrone Tracy can't do, which is be big around the goal line. I can imagine him poaching a lot of touchdowns in that area, but I can't imagine getting a whole lot of touches that aren't short yardage. I feel like Tracy's a little bit more explosive, and I can't imagine them using Scatterboo a lot in the receiving game. So I think this is going to be a real ugly committee. Hopefully, at least it turns into a two-man committee and we get a little bit of clarity on it. But I don't like the flaw with Scatterboo. I think the upside's there. It is possible he becomes the clear number one guy, and all of a sudden you've got a running back two on your hands. But I think the chance of him being a true number one guy is pretty low. We saw even when Saquon Barkley was there, they struggled to use him effectively. I don't know why that would suddenly happen with Scatterboo when he is in an ugly committee situation. Travis Etienne, also a guy in an ugly committee. We don't really know what's going on at the moment in Jacksonville. They've got a heap of running back options. They already had Etienne and Bigsby. They weren't happy with what they had, so they brought in Tootin. And they also have Kalen Robinson, of course, who was not great last season. Having said that, none of the runners were particularly great last season. I feel like in general, they just need to sort out their O-line situation. He only had 2 touchdowns last season, Travis Etienne, which really hurt him. They do use Bigsby a lot around the goal line, and these Etienne is more of a receiving back. So it can give you averagely consistent output on a weekly basis. The problem is his role was not particularly stable last season. Now, I talked about Najee Harris earlier, and I still have concerns about what this is going to look like for the Chargers. It is possible they just want to run the ball a heap and have 2 guys they're going to give a lot of touches to, but Harris has gotten to 1,000 yards by volume rather than efficiency in Pittsburgh. I do think the Chargers are going to be able to run the ball far more efficiently, and we should see his yards per carry move up from 4 to about 5 odd. But unless he's still getting at least 200 odd carries, I don't think that's going to be much for fantasy. So I think gone are the days of his running back 3 finish in his first season. I think we're talking about a guy who's going to be a running back 3 overall, as in the position running back 3 at best. I think we're talking about a guy who's probably going to be 30th odd on your average season, could easily fall out and become a true backup. Having said that, if Hampton gets injured, all of a sudden you've got a guy who could be a fantasy monster. So he nearly falls into that handcuffed category where you can get some quality out of him on a weekly basis. And I think early in the season we could see him used a little bit. And then you're just hoping for a Hampton injury, and all of a sudden you've got a guy who's going to get a lot of touches, be very efficient, and could turn into a running back 1. At least that's the hope for me with Najee Harris. Not that I'm going out of my way to get him. Jaden Blue's in a very different situation. He was only a 5th-round running back, but this is an empty depth chart. I do think, especially as an early-down running back, he can beat out Javonte Williams. It's not like Miles Sanders is excellent in that area either. So I think that Blue could easily take over the early down work. We have seen the Cowboys be willing to use day 3 running backs. I'm thinking Tony Pollard. And it's possible that Blue turns into that guy. So I think the upside is there, but gosh, the floor is very low. I think it's entirely possible as well. He's not used at all. And we're talking about a guy who just barely sees the field at any point in time. That's typically the play with 5th-round running backs. Not many 5th-round running backs turn into starters, but I think if someone is going to, Jalen Blue is the guy who will. Along with Blue, Tootin obviously goes into a situation where he is lower down the depth chart, but it's not like it's impossible to get past Etienne and Bigsby. They were both pretty poor last season. So he's in a depth chart with a couple of, in this case, slightly younger veterans, but he certainly has upside and he's got plenty of quality. I do think he could end up being a very solid back. He had a couple of 1,000-yard season with Virginia Tech to close out his college career. And I do feel like this is a guy who could challenge the other guys in the backfield. It's just a case of whether he actually succeeds in getting a role and how long that takes. And that's a limiting factor in fantasy. J.K. Dobbins, I like as a player, but he doesn't even have a team yet. So it's really hard to rely on a guy where we don't know where he's going. We don't exactly know how healthy he is. He looked pretty darn good last season, admittedly. But there is a concern indeed that he ends up staying in LA. or even if he goes elsewhere, that there's not a number one role for him. So it's hard to feel great about him until we know exactly what's happening this season. So I've kind of stuck him in here around these other guys where it's possible they do absolutely nothing, and it's possible they turn into a number one running back, at least on their team. Dobbins, we know, is a little bit limited by his receiving ability. He's never been particularly good there. He got 32 receptions last season and was averaging like 5 yards a reception, which is really poor. So it is possible that will step up, and that was just an issue with the offense. But I think it's entirely possible that wherever he goes, he's not used in as a receiving option, and that's going to hurt in PPR. Rashad White, I liked in college, and he did turn out pretty well in 2023, and then dropped off badly last year as they started to move him into more of a number 2 role behind Bucky Irving. He is still someone that gets used a little bit around the goal line. He's a real receiving back. He's had at least 50 receptions each of the last 3 seasons. If he can at least keep up that role, he's still someone that's going to be useful for PPR Dynasty. He's more of like a bye week filler, and he always has upside for if Irving gets injured. Kendre Miller has plenty of upside in the possibility he takes over from Alvin Kamara. The problem for Miller has been staying healthy, and he hasn't even looked particularly good when he's found the field. It's hard to tell if that's because he hasn't been healthy, if the offense in general has been struggling, if they're not using him effectively. But the team still does seem to really like him, and I do think there's the possibility he turns into a guy who is a little bit of a weapon down the stretch. He's someone that I like the idea of rostering and just keeping on my bench. And then later on in the season, when it turns out the team is once again losing, they sit Kamara in the last year of his contract and they give Miller a crack. I think that could be really good for fantasy. Trey Benson, likewise, is someone that could eventually take over from James Conner, and I feel like the upside is there. So for that reason, I'm benching him as more of a handcuff that has the upside to take over that role on merit if the team is struggling and the aging running back ahead of him isn't able to do it anymore. Zach Charbonnet is more of a true handcuff. I don't think there's any situation where he's going to take over as the lead runner from Kenneth Walker, but he is the best pure handcuff around. Whenever Walker is out, and he is often out, all of a sudden Charbonnet becomes a monster. He was the running back 26 last season, and he really wasn't the starting running back for more than about half a dozen games. But he's so efficient when he is, and he has so many big games when that happens, that he's someone you can bench and bring in and get him very cheaply as well. So I really like Charbonnet as a dynasty weapon. He's someone that you should definitely be considering. Jalen Warren's very much, on the other hand, a guy that you can use as a bye week filler, but I feel like his upside's very low. I feel like even if we have a situation where there's an injury to Caleb Johnson ahead of him, or if Warren somehow wins the starting role, it's always going to be a committee. Even if Warren's the main guy, they bring in one of the bench guys. We'll see more of Kenny Gainwell, or we'll see more of even Trey Sermon as the bigger bodied guy. I just don't think they trust Warren in that role, and he's always going to be a change of pace guy who, when even the number one guy doesn't get more than a dozen or so touches in a game. And that really does limit him. Jordan Mason, on the other hand, if we see an injury to Aaron Jones, and we have seen plenty in the past, I think he could turn into a strong number one running back that could easily end up in the top 10. If Jones didn't play this season, and there's no reason he wouldn't without an injury, I think Mason would be a top 10 running back. I think we've seen him do a very good job, averaging 5.2 yards a carry at least in each of his 3 seasons. He has been given very few touches, and we don't really know how he'd handle a workload over a number of games, and we've seen him get injured last season. But I do think the upside is there, and I really like the idea of taking him, especially if you have the bench space. Tyjae Spears fits into a similar category, but I think the upside is lower because even if Tony Pollard's out, all of a sudden Spears isn't going to be a massive weapon in that Titans offense. But he is someone that's going to get some touches, and you can use him in a bye week. And if Pollard is out, all of a sudden he at least becomes someone you can start as a running back too. I really like the idea of stashing Rico Dowdle on my bench because there is an injury to Chuba Hubbard. We know that Dowdle can be very good. He went over 1,000 yards last season. I think that we could see him be very good this season. I'm concerned about Trevor Etienne coming in there and messing that up, but I don't really rate the younger Etienne as a weapon. So for that reason, I think that Dowdle's the clear number 2. And we know that Chuba Hubbard has had some injuries in the past. And if that happens, Dowdle steps in and becomes the number 1 guy. A guy that's going to be hanging around there for some time is Jonathan Brooks. And this, unlike the other guys who are very much bench now options, this is very much a stash now situation. If you're in a rebuild, Brooks is someone you can get onto your bench and then eventually get onto IR, or maybe put on IR already, depending on your league settings. And he's going to give you the potential of being a weapon in a few years' time. Now, I think it's entirely possible that he eventually just retires and he never takes on a starting role, or that he kind of hangs around as a number 2 or number 3 based on all of his injuries. Those injuries do really sap the explosiveness of running backs, but we know the recovery is better than it used to be, and it is possible that Brooks comes back and eventually goes back to being the guy he was drafted to be. I don't think that's going to be with Carolina, but it could be somewhere, so you can stash him on IR for a year or two and then see what happens. I really like the upside of Woody Marks. I feel like he hangs around as a receiving weapon for the next season or two and eventually takes over for Joe Mixon as the number 1 guy. I think the upside is truly there. I'm taking him around the 4th round of a lot of rookie drafts, and I feel like he's someone I really want you to have on your roster in Dynasty as well, because I feel like there is plenty of upside there. He was very good as a receiving weapon in college, and receiving running backs in a PPR league is so valuable. So go out and get Woody Marks. Blake Corum was disappointing last season. The fact that they drafted Jarquez Hunter really hurts his upside as a handcuff back. I do still think that Corum is probably the main backup, but I think he's a lot more limited by that. I don't think he's any longer somebody that you can feel really good about rostering and knowing that if there's an injury ahead of him, all of a sudden it becomes a weapon. I feel like this is more of an ugly situation, and for that reason, he drops down for me. In at number 50, Isaac Guerendo. This is a great handcuff situation. We just don't know exactly what's going to happen. The problem, of course, with Guerendo is you're hardly going to see him touch the ball when McCaffrey's playing. So you do need a McCaffrey injury. That could occur. But then Guerendo potentially ends up in a situation where he's battling with other guys. We know that they've brought in the rookie Jordan James. They've still got Taylor there, for example. I don't think he necessarily takes on the lead role, but I think it's likely he does, and it gives him plenty of upside because San Fran does like giving the ball to one guy and just having them carry it all game. So Guerendo has upside, but he does require that injury. And unlike the other guys around here, he's less likely to earn the lead role over CMC. Now, there are plenty of other guys down below this that you should definitely check out, and you can go check out the full list over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. A couple I want to shout out. Audric Estime comes in next behind these guys. I like his upside because I do think he could turn out to be the big back in Denver. And if RJ Harvey struggles, which I think he might, all of a sudden Estime has a chance at that lead role. He wasn't very good last year, which is why I've got him so far down. But at least the situation indicates that he's going to get opportunities. Braylon Allen, Ray Davis, and Marshall and Lloyd are all very much handcuff backs. I do like the idea of rostering them in case there's an injury in front of them. I feel like the upside is there. They're all very talented. Jalen Wright probably in that same situation. And I feel like someone like a Keaton Mitchell is someone that you can feel good about rostering, knowing that in a season or two's time, it's possible Derrick Henry's gone, and they just give the ball to Mitchell. He's a much smaller back, but he's explosive, and I feel like he could offer you something in Dynasty. Last guy I want to mention is Tyler Algier. Obviously, we know that Bijan Robinson is the number 1 guy. Well, when Robinson's injured, it really is Algier who takes over that lead role. It's not like there's another guy who threatens him, and he gets plenty of volume when that occurs. So as a pure handcuff, he is certainly an option as well. And that's all I've got for my running back rankings for 2025. This is my version 2. Make sure you go check them out over at the website at ffdfantasyfootball.com. If you've got questions, leave them in the comments below or hit us up on Instagram or Twitter. It'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. It has literally had the sun go down the time I've been recording this. So I hope you're having a fantastic morning or evening wherever you are. And I look forward to catching up with you in a couple of days' time for my wide receiver show. I will see you then.